I'll start out with a quote from the late Edward Said. "Nothing in my mind," says Said, "is more reprehensible than those habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, that characteristic turning away from a difficult and principled position which you know to be the right one, but which you decide not to take. You do not want to appear too political. You want to keep a reputation for being balanced, objective, moderate. For an intellectual, these habits of mind," says Said, "are corrupting par excellence. Personally," he says, "I have encountered them in one of the toughest of all contemporary issues, Palestine, where fear of speaking out about one of the greatest injustices in modern history has hobbled, blinkered, muzzled many who know the truth and are in a position to serve it. For despite the abuse and vilification that any outspoken supporter of Palestinian rights and self-determination earns for him or herself, the truth deserves to be spoken." I think because a determining factor that connects our struggle for rights, for equality, and for self-determination to the civil struggle for social justice and economic justice in this country is that our oppression and dispossession have "Made in the USA" written all over them. A progressive transformation in your government's priorities from directing this nation's great wealth into wars and hegemony, to investing in universal health care, dignified housing, a school system that's conducive to critical and contextual learning and development, decent jobs, and reversing the fatal damage to the environment, is not only good on its own merits for the people of this country, for the working men and women of this country, it's also good for the world, for Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Africa, Latin America, and most certainly for Palestine. A lot has been said about our campaign, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, by many, many sides. But as Said says, we need to tell the truth. What exactly are we facing that makes us call upon the world for BDS? There are three forms of oppression. It's often obscured. You often don't hear about them. You often hear about the occupation alone, as if that is the only ill befalling Palestinians. In fact, that's not very accurate. It's the most talked about, but it's not the most important injustice that Palestinians are facing today. There are three forms of injustice that the Palestinian civil society call for BDS in 2005 focuses on. It's a comprehensive approach to Palestinian rights. First, the occupation, yes, and colonization of the 1967 territory, and that includes East Jerusalem, but also the system of racial discrimination within Israel itself, and that's a form of apartheid according to the UN definition of apartheid. And third and foremost is the right of return for Palestinian refugees that Israel has denied for 6 decades. The right of return is not just a moral issue, it's a pragmatic issue. The majority of the Palestinians are refugees. If you end the occupation tomorrow and you do not talk about the refugees' return, you will not have solved the question of Palestine. The majority of the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed in 1948, 1967, and ever since, and they form the majority of the Palestinian people. So we need to address the three rights, the three fundamental rights accorded to us by international law. So in the BDS movement, we do not adopt a political solution. It's a consensus movement. Almost the entire Palestinian civil society is represented in it. For many decades, we haven't had anything that all Palestinians agree on, actually. We disagree on everything. Where the sun rises from, you'll find two different opinions. But on BDS, we seem to have near consensus among the Palestinians. There's a very short list of those who do not support it. One term that I mentioned particularly stands out, the issue of apartheid. And there's a lot of discussion, and people say, oh, but you cannot compare with South Africa. Are there differences? Apartheid is not about comparing with South Africa. There's no connection. Apartheid is not monopolized by South Africa. You had apartheid here in this country long before South Africa. So it's not something that only exists in South Africa. The name came from the special laws that applied in South Africa. But the system of institutionalized, legalized discrimination existed in this country and exists in Israel today. And by the way, the US State Department, hardly a reference for human rights, but issues a human rights report every year. And in that report, it does every single year. It condemns Israel's, quote, institutionalized, legal, and societal discrimination against its Arab citizens. The US State Department. According to the UN Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, Israel's two-tiered laws, two-tiered systems of laws, within Israel itself, forget the occupied territories, does conform to the definition of apartheid. Israel is a state that distinguishes between its Jewish citizens and its non-Jewish citizens. Only a Jew can be a national of the State of Israel. A non-Jew born in Israel, like my wife, can never become a national. You have to be Jewish. And if you're not a national, you're not allowed to buy, rent, or live on 93% of the state land of Israel. Even in South Africa, the proportion was much better. Only 86% of the land was off limits to non-whites. But let's take also, other than the UN definition, which is extremely important, let's take the testimony of the founder of apartheid. As far back as 1961, Hendrik Verwoerd, the South African Prime Minister and architect of the Grand Apartheid vision of the Bantustans, said in a very politically incorrect way, so excuse the coarseness, quote, the Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. He knows what he's talking about. So, the most important issue about BDS from the other side, if you have read the mainstream reports about BDS from the Israeli side, the Israel lobby in this country, I'm sure the Presbyterian Church was attacked with this, Sabeel and so on, is that you're delegitimizing Israel. The problem with BDS, yes, it's effective, yes, it's nonviolent, but it delegitimizes Israel. And that's the problem with it. What exactly are we delegitimizing in the BDS movement? We're delegitimizing oppression. We're delegitimizing injustice. We're delegitimizing occupation and apartheid. We're not delegitimizing any group of human beings. We're delegitimizing the injustice and oppression that they're doing to us, period. The drones that you saw were mostly developed by Technion University, and so on and so forth. Tel Aviv University alone prides itself for having 55 projects, weapons projects for the Israeli army. Excuse me. So the Israeli Academy is far from innocent or a bystander. It's very much a main part of the system of oppression. Promoting ethical investment by trade unions, faith-based organizations, local councils, national pension funds, and so on, by divesting from companies profiting from Israel's occupation and apartheid. Not just Israeli companies, American companies, international companies. Caterpillar is not an Israeli company, Motorola is not an Israeli company, but they're both extremely boycottable because they're very complicit in our oppression. I think there's no longer an excuse not to divest. Yes, we appreciate that the Presbyterian Church was at the vanguard of discussing divestment. At the vanguard, when no one else was, the Presbyterian Church was the most courageous. But 6 years later, they are still deliberating. There is no more excuse for this procrastination. People are dying. When faced with extreme conditions of acts of genocide, as Richard Falk, the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, has called them, acts of genocide, you need to do more than just deliberate. 4, promoting ethical corporate responsibility, leading to divestment from and the boycott of products of companies, whether Israeli or international, that are implicated in the violation of international law, such as Elbit, Veolia, Motorola, and others. 5, promoting ethical pilgrimage to the Holy Land by directly benefiting Palestinian hotels, restaurants, coach services, guides, and so on. Many pilgrims stay at Israeli hotels, go to Israeli restaurants, and so on and so forth. And the Palestinian economy gains absolutely nothing. Bethlehem is dying. The economy in Bethlehem is dying because all those pilgrims come and go and nothing is spent in Bethlehem. 6, applying public pressure to ostracize the Jewish National Fund, JNF, and to deny it its current legal status as a tax-exempt charitable organization. 7, lobbying local councils and regional governments to strictly apply domestic and international laws which urge the preclusion from public contracts of companies involved in grave misconduct. We succeeded in many cases in Europe in denying companies involved in the Israeli occupation and apartheid from bidding for big contracts. In Sweden, for example, we had a huge victory against Veolia, and I mentioned that in the workshop yesterday. We made Veolia lose a bid for $4.5 billion in the metro, for Stockholm Metro. And the Church of Sweden was our main partner there, by the way. 8, applying public effective pressure on public officials and political parties to heed Amnesty International call for an immediate arms embargo on all parties in the Middle East. Yes, Amnesty has called for all parties, embargo on all parties. Of course, it's equivocating and it's comparing the oppressor with the oppressed, but it's okay, don't sell Apache to Hamas. We don't mind. Cut off F-16s to all parties, we don't mind. 9, calling for an immediate suspension of all free trade and other preferential trade agreements with Israel. We're doing that. In Europe, we're working with the Latin Americans as well to cut off the Mercosur-Israel free trade agreement. So this is a main part of our work. 10, holding Israel accountable for fully compensating the Palestinian people and the donor countries as well for the illegal wanton destruction it brought upon Palestinian society, economy, and many institutions. 11, and that's the last one, applying pressure for the immediate and unconditional implementation of the Goldstone Report's recommendations. Now, in discussing all this, it's very important to state that the BDS call is based on international law and universal human rights. As such, it is opposed to all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We do not condone any form of racism. This is not a boycott of Jews, absolutely not. This is not a boycott of Jewish businesses. We couldn't care less what religious or ethnic identity Israel is. All we care about is our oppressor, and we shall continue to resist it until we end its oppression. Last but not least, many people think that given all these odds, that many people would despair. Dr. Gilbert spoke about hope, and so did Lubna. And this is something that we've learned not to do. We do not despair. For 6 decades, we've been fighting this without despair. And mostly non-violently, by the way. This is something that's not reported in your media. You can only see in your media some very violent forms of resistance, which is legal, so long as it does not hurt innocent civilians. But BDS, by definition, is a non-violent form of resistance. So we are not despairing, we are resisting. But to keep hope alive in front of all this hegemonic system of oppression, we absolutely need your solidarity. We don't need charity. We don't need your money. We have always been proud and able to produce and sustain ourselves. Israel destroys our lands, our water aquifers, our fertile lands, thanks mostly to your tax money. We just want you to end this complicity, and we can take care of the rest. Thus, BDS. Thank you.